Welcome to your deep dive. Today, we're going to be stepping off the beaten path a little bit in Japan, trading those cherry blossoms in Shinkansen for something a little bit more critical of the country.
Right.
We're diving deep into Alex Kerr's Dogs and Demons, Tales from the Dark Side of Japan.
Yes.
A book that really pulls no punches.
Definitely not.
You know, it's the kind of read that leaves you thinking, wow, I never thought about that when it comes to Japan. What was your first impression? Was it as eye-opening for you as it was for me?
Yeah, you know what struck me right away was how Kerr doesn't just, point out problems, he connects them.
Right.
It's not just, about a concrete obsessed construction industry or a culture of deceit.
Right.
It's how these things are all intertwined, stemming from a deeper cultural mentality.
Yeah, that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating. Look like a puzzle. And we're trying to figure out how all the pieces fit together. So let's start with this construction state idea that Kerr keeps coming back to.
Yeah.
He uses some pretty strong language, even calling it an addiction.
Oh, yeah. He's not exaggerating at all.
Yeah.
In the early 90s, Japan was pouring over 18% of its entire GNP into construction.
Wow.
Just think about that. Almost a fifth of the country's economic output just going into concrete.
Yeah.
And in the U.S., at that time, it was less than half of that.
Wow. You've spent a lot of time in Japan. Did you ever get a sense that construction was almost out of control?
Oh, absolutely. And Kerr gives some really compelling examples.
Yeah.
Take the Izahaya Bay dikes.
Right.
This massive project that was meant to reclaim land for farming ended up devastating the local ecosystem.
Oh, wow.
The fishermen lost their livelihoods, and the environmental damage was severe.
Yeah.
And Kerr argues that it was all driven by, bureaucratic self-interest and political maneuvering.
Wow.
Not actual need.
And it's not even an isolated incident, right?
Exactly.
There's a whole chapter on these monuments to waste. These grand, often bizarre projects that seem more about spending money than actually benefiting people.
Right, like those airports built specifically to airlift vegetables.
Yeah.
It sounds like something out of a Monty Python skit.
I know, it's crazy.
But it gets to the heart of Kerr's argument that in Japan, there's this ingrained belief in the power of concrete to solve problems,
Right.
even when it creates new ones.
So this construction frenzy,
Yeah.
it isn't just about economics.
Right.
It's about something deeper, right?
Yeah.
This desire to control, to impose order on the landscape.
Yeah.
And it's not just the physical landscape that's being reshaped. Kerr argues that this mentality has seeped into other aspects of Japanese culture, even the way people view nature.
It's this fascinating paradox. You have these ancient traditions that are celebrating the beauty and tranquility of nature.
Right.
Yet modern Japan seems determined to tame and control it.
Yeah.
Kerr calls it state-sponsored vandalism.
And it's not just about big construction projects, is it? He talks about how even something as seemingly simple as planting trees becomes this exercise in control.
Yeah.
Remember that anecdote about the residents complaining about trees blocking sunlight?
Oh, yeah.
It's a small detail, but it's so revealing.
It is.
It shows this disconnect from the traditional ideal of living in harmony with nature.
Right.
Instead, nature becomes something to be managed and manipulated, even subdued. It's almost like they're trying to create a perfectly manicured bonsai version of the entire country.
Of Japan.
And this desire for control, for everything to be neat and orderly, seems to extend beyond just the physical environment.
Right.
Kerr argues that it plays a role in this culture of deceit that he describes.
This is where things start to get really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Kerr pulls back the curtain on how information is managed, controlled, and often suppressed in Japan.
Right.
The Minamata mercury poisoning case is a horrifying example.
Yeah, that was a tragedy that unfolded over decades, with the company knowingly polluting the bay.
Right.
And people suffering terrible health consequences.
Yeah.
What struck me was how long it took for the truth to come out and for anyone to be held accountable.
And Kerr argues that this wasn't just an isolated incident.
Right.
He points to the Tokai nuclear plant incident,
Yeah.
where the initial reports downplayed the severity of the accident.
Yeah.
Even the workers who were sent in to clean up weren't adequately protected.
It's disturbing because it suggests a pattern of prioritizing harmony and avoiding embarrassment
Right.
over transparency and accountability.
Exactly.
And this culture of secrecy,
Yeah.
of not rocking the boat, allows other problems to fester. like the corruption within the bureaucracy.
The concept of amakodari is a perfect example.
Right.
It's this system where retired bureaucrats get cushy, high-paying jobs in the very industries they used to regulate.
Wow.
It creates this web of conflicts of interest and breeds a culture of favoritism.
And it's not just like small-time corruption either.
Yeah.
Kerr talks about cases of bribery and cover-ups at the highest levels of government,
Yeah.
including the Olympic Bidding Committee, burning financial records.
It's a system that thrives on opacity,
Wow.
where backroom deals and unspoken agreements are the norm.
Yeah.
And it's all facilitated by this culture of deceit that Kerr so meticulously exposes.
Okay, so we have this powerful bureaucracy operating in secrecy.
Mm-hmm.
And they have a lot of money to spend thanks to those make-work construction jobs.
Right.
Where does all that money go?
Yeah.
Well, according to Kerr, a lot of it goes towards those monuments to waste.
Mm-hmm.
Can you unpack that a bit more for us?
Yeah, he uses this term Zaito, which is essentially a hidden second budget
Oh, wow.
that's used to fund these extravagant, often unnecessary projects.
Wow.
Think of things like the teleport town in Tokyo,
Right.
this futuristic development that never quite took off,
Yeah.
or those vegetable airlifting airports that we talked about.
It's almost like they're building these things just for the sake of building them.
Mm-hmm.
But Kerr argues that there's a deeper psychological motivation at play here.
Yeah,
He suggests it's about projecting an image of power and progress,
right.
even if it comes at the cost of real value and long-term sustainability.
Yeah, he compares it to a homeowner who's like deeply in debt,
Oh, wow.
but keeps adding like expensive additions to their house to impress the neighbors.
Yeah.
It's a facade,
Yeah.
a way to mask the underlying problems.
Right.
And unfortunately, this facade is costing Japan dearly, both financially and culturally.
So we're starting to see how this construction obsession ties into the culture of deceit
Mm-hmm.
and the bureaucratic corruption.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't stop there, does it?
It doesn't.
Kerr argues that this mentality has even shaped the education system.
Oh, he's highly critical of the Japanese education system.
Yeah.
He argues that it focuses way too much on rote memorization and conformity.
Right.
And it just squashes creativity and independent thinking.
Yeah.
He paints a rather bleak picture of schools where uniforms are rigid, bullying is rampant,
Yeah.
and students are pressured to fit in rather than stand out.
He even tells a story about a student who was ostracized for being outspoken.
Yeah.
It really highlights this fear of going against the grain,
Mm-hmm.
which seems to be ingrained from a young age.
And Kerr argues that this emphasis on conformity continues all the way to the top,
Wow.
even at prestigious institutions like Tokyo University.
Yeah.
He compares them to canning factories, churning out graduates who are technically proficient,
Right.
but lacking in critical thinking skills and creativity.
It's like they're training people to be cogs in a machine,
Yeah.
not innovators or visionaries.
Mm-hmm.
Which leads to a pretty interesting question. If the education system is churning out conformists,
Right.
how does that impact Japanese society as a whole?
That's a question we'll explore further in part 2 of this deep dive.
Okay.
We'll look at how this culture of conformity plays out in everything from leisure and recreation to art and entertainment. And we'll start to unpack some of the potential consequences of this approach, both for Japan and for the rest of the world.
Sounds good. I'm looking forward to it. So we've uncovered some pretty unsettling aspects of Japanese society through Kerr's analysis of the construction state and this culture of deceit.
Mm.
But it feels like we've only scratched the surface here.
Yeah.
Where do we go from here?
Well, one of the most thought-provoking ideas I think that Kerr introduces is this poor people, strong state policy.
Okay.
It sounds kind of like a contradiction, but he argues that it's been a key factor in Japan's economic success.
Okay. Unpack that a bit for me.
Yeah.
What does he mean by poor people, strong state?
So Kerr argues that there's been this unspoken agreement in Japan.
Okay.
The people accept a lower quality of life,
Mm-hmm.
things like cramped housing, long working hours, fewer personal freedoms,
Right.
all in exchange for national economic growth.
Wow.
It's like they've prioritized the collective good over individual comfort.
I remember that anecdote he shares about the German publisher visiting a typical Japanese suburb
Right.
and mistaking it for like a poor neighborhood.
Yeah.
It really highlights this acceptance of a certain level of, well, let's call it frugality, that might seem strange to outsiders.
Exactly. And Kerr argues that this mentality, while maybe beneficial in like the early stages of industrialization, has created a situation where people aren't necessarily demanding better.
Yeah.
And it ties back into the construction industry, too.
Okay.
All those massive, sometimes wasteful projects reinforce this image of the strong state,
Right.
even if they aren't directly improving people's lives.
It's like those grand public work projects become these monuments to collective sacrifice. They're a physical manifestation of this this endure mentality Kerr talks about.
Yeah, this endure versus enjoy mindset extends beyond just work and housing.
Right.
Kerr argues that it's impacted how Japanese people even approach leisure and recreation. He talks about the lack of like well-designed hotels and resorts that incorporate traditional aesthetics.
Right.
Instead, you have these like theme parks that are replicating European cities.
Yeah.
Or even more bizarrely, a replica of Mount Rushmore.
It's like they're seeking beauty and escape in these artificial environments.
Right.
Because their own cities and countryside have become so dominated by concrete and conformity.
Yeah.
It's almost a bit sad, isn't it?
Kerr definitely seems to think so.
Yeah.
He sees it as a lack of confidence in Japan's own cultural heritage. And it's not just architecture and design.
Right.
He makes a similar critique of Japanese cinema.
Yeah, he's pretty harsh on modern Japanese films,
He is.
saying most are targeted at children and teenagers with an overemphasis on cute characters and storylines.
Yeah.
What do you make of this argument? Is he being too dismissive of contemporary Japanese film?
I think Kerr does acknowledge some exceptions.
Okay.
But his main point is that there's this lack of depth, a missing core ingredient, as he calls it.
Right.
He seems to be arguing that this retreat into like cuteness and escapism, it's kind of symptomatic of a larger cultural trend,
Right.
a reluctance to engage with more challenging themes.
It goes back to that endure mentality, doesn't it? Maybe it's just easier to escape into these lighthearted worlds
Right.
than to confront the complexities of modern life.
And remember, Kerr links this back to the education system,
Right.
which he argues doesn't encourage critical thinking or individual expression.
Yeah.
So you have this cycle where people are conditioned to conform,
Right.
to seek comfort in the familiar, and to avoid rocking the boat.
It paints a pretty bleak picture.
It does.
But does Kerr offer any solutions?
Well,
Or is he just content to point out the problems?
he does highlight a few glimmers of hope.
Yeah.
He talks about the citizens of Kyoto who successfully opposed the construction of that bizarre Pont des Arts bridge,
Right.
this replica of the one in Paris. It's an example of grassroots activism challenging this top-down approach to development.
That's encouraging.
It is.
It shows that people aren't just passively accepting these decisions. They're willing to fight for what they believe in.
And Kerr also highlights the work of artists and entrepreneurs who are bucking the trend.
Well,
Like architect Tadao Ando and fashion designer Issey Miyake.
Right.
They're creating things that are both modern and uniquely Japanese,
Yeah.
drawing inspiration from tradition, but not afraid to innovate.
So there's still this creative spirit alive in Japan. It's just maybe been overshadowed by the functions of conformity and control.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think Kerr's hope is that by exposing these problems, by shining a light on the dark side, he can spark a conversation,
Right.
a reawakening of that innovative spirit that he believes is essential for Japan's future.
That's a powerful message.
It is.
But is it realistic? Can a society that's been so successful by embracing certain values suddenly shift course? It seems like a pretty daunting challenge.
That's the big question Kerr leaves us with.
Yeah.
He doesn't provide any easy answers,
Right.
but he does offer a framework for thinking about the choices that we make, both as individuals and as a society.
Right.
Do we continue down this path of endure and conformity?
Right.
Or do we strive to create a future that's more aligned with our deeper values?
It's a question that's relevant not just for Japan,
Right.
but for any society grappling with the pressures of modernization and globalization.
Yeah.
And it's a question that we'll continue to explore in part 3 of this deep dive,
Okay.
where we'll delve deeper into Kerr's concept of jiu-jitsu and what it means for finding real value and meaning
Right.
in a world that often prioritizes the superficial.
Yeah.
We've spent the last 2 parts of this deep dive kind of unpacking Alex Kerr's critique of Japan. And it's been a bit of a roller coaster, so
It has.
we've gone from concrete monstrosities to the cutenification of culture. From bureaucratic corruption to an education system that seems to prize conformity over creativity. But Kerr isn't just like a doom and gloom kind of guy.
No, not at all.
He does offer a glimmer of hope. And it's tied to this idea of jitsu that you mentioned earlier. Can you explain that a little more for our listener?
Yeah, it's a complex concept.
Right.
But like at its core, it's about a connection to real value, to authenticity and purpose.
Okay.
And Kerr argues that modern Japan, in its pursuit of economic growth and material progress, has kind of lost touch with this jujitsu.
You know, it's interesting because in a way, he's suggesting that Japan's very success might be a contributing factor to its current predicament.
Yeah.
It seems counterintuitive, but is it possible that that relentless drive for growth has come at the cost of something deeper?
That's exactly what Kerr is getting at. He uses this really striking analogy of a frog being slowly boiled alive. Like if you drop a frog into boiling water, it'll jump right out.
Right.
But if you put it in cold water and gradually raise the temperature, it won't notice the danger until it's too late.
Wow. That's a pretty vivid image.
Yeah.
And I think it makes sense in the context of Japan's rapid modernization. The country went from a largely agrarian society to an economic powerhouse in a remarkably short period of time. Maybe it happened so fast that people didn't have time to fully process the trade-offs, the compromises that were being made along the way.
Exactly.
And now, as Kerr points out, Japan is the world's largest debtor nation.
It is.
Those massive public works projects, those monuments to waste, have contributed to a staggering national debt.
Yeah.
It's like they've mortgaged their future for the sake of short-term gains. And it's not just about economics. Kerr also critiques Japan's relationship with the global community. He argues that despite being this economic powerhouse, Japan has remained culturally isolated, resisting true internationalization. He points to the low number of foreign exchange students coming to Japan and the difficulties that foreigners face in building meaningful careers there.
Yeah, it seems like Japan wants the benefits of global trade and influence, but isn't really willing to fully embrace the cultural exchange that comes with it.
Yeah, it's like they want to have their sushi and eat it too, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly.
But as we all know, you can't really have one without the other. And as the world becomes increasingly interconnected, this kind of insularity can be a real disadvantage.
Absolutely. And as Japan faces new challenges like a shrinking workforce due to an aging population, it needs to find new ways to innovate and compete. Like clinging to these outdated systems and resisting outside ideas isn't a recipe for success in the 21st century.
So is Kerr just being pessimistic here? Or does he offer any concrete solutions to these rather daunting problems?
He doesn't lay out like a step-by-step plan, but he does suggest that Japan needs to kind of reconnect with its own traditions of innovation, individuality, and appreciation for beauty. The very things that have been eroded by this single-minded pursuit of economic growth.
It's like he's saying, look, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. You already have these amazing cultural resources, these values that have sustained you for centuries. Tap into those, adapt them to the modern world, and you'll find your way back to Jitsu.
And it's not just about nostalgia, you know, about clinging to the past. It's about recognizing that there's a wisdom in those traditions. A way of seeing the world that's perhaps more holistic, more sustainable than the purely materialist worldview that's come to dominate modern society.
He does offer a few examples of individuals and communities who are already doing this right.
Oh, absolutely.
People who are pushing back against a trend of conformity and finding ways to live more authentic, meaningful lives.
Yeah, he highlights the artisans who are keeping traditional crafts alive.
The entrepreneurs who are creating businesses that are both innovative and socially responsible. And the activists who are fighting to protect the environment and preserve cultural heritage. These are the seeds of like a new Japan. A Japan that's both modern and rooted in its jitsu.
So what are we left with after this deep dive into dogs and demons? It's certainly not a feel-good read.
No.
But it is incredibly thought-provoking.
It is a wake-up call, not just for Japan, but for any society that's facing these challenges of rapid modernization and globalization.
It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves, to question our assumptions, and to consider whether the path we're on is truly leading us toward a better future.
And while Kerr doesn't offer like easy answers, he does leave us with this powerful challenge to rediscover our own jitsu, to reconnect with those values that give our lives meaning and purpose.
Yeah, and to build a world that's not just materially prosperous, but spiritually rich as well.
Yeah, that's something we can all strive for no matter where we live or what our background is.
Well said.
And on that note, we want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Yes, thank you.
We hope it sparked some new ideas and inspired you to look at the world with a more critical, yet hopeful eye.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening.